here. That for anybody who feels they did not get enough out of the presentation last week because of the Zoom problems, I refer you to the website of First Church.
It's a hot corner.
There is a YouTube site for Great Decisions, and you can see not just last week's, but any of the presentations, and within a few days, including the one this evening. That I'm delighted to have my longtime friend, my go-to guy on Latin America for many years, including when I was at the State Department, Harold Trincunas. Harold is a deputy director of Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He manages lots of activities, but in his spare time, he continues to write a great deal about Latin America. As you have become accustomed with me, I don't use up substantive time by giving extensive introductions. So with that, I will turn the program over to Harold, and he and I look forward to your questions after his talk. Harold.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And it's great to be back here at Great Decisions. I think this is my first time back since 2020. So it's nice to be back in this room again, in fact. I really appreciate the invitation from my friend and colleague, Tom Fingard, to come talk to you about Latin America. I know some of you may have read through the materials that the Great Decisions program has shared on Latin America. My talk tonight we'll touch on some of the issues that are raised in that article, but I'll also bring some of my own insights to bear from my work on Latin America. I've been working on it throughout most of my academic career, but I'll also confess I'm originally from Venezuela. So I actually grew up in the region, and I've been following its politics quite closely because I was a huge politics nerd when I was growing up. So I'd be happy to share sort of my insights about the region. So I think one of the things to keep in mind, and actually one of the things I liked about the Great Decisions piece that was shared with you in advance, was taking a nuanced approach to the region. I think we tend to think of Latin America, and then we think of one unified or homogeneous region with similar characteristics across many different countries. We don't tend to distinguish necessarily in the news unless something terrible is happening in one particular country. Lots of discussions, even in academic circles, tend to say Latin America to refer to a very diverse region. And in fact, funnily enough, the term Latin America actually was originally popularized by the French in the mid-19th century as a counter to Spanish America or Portuguese or Brazilian America. This was when the French were trying to expand their influence in Latin America. You may recall they've installed the Archduke of Austria on the throne as the Emperor of Mexico in the mid-19th century. This was during the U.S. Civil War. We were a little distracted at the time. That didn't last very long. The Mexicans eventually threw him out, along with the French troops of Emperor Napoleon III. But to justify their role in Latin America, they came up with the term Latin, that this sort of included France into the kind of civilizations that had originated the countries in the region. So I think let's sort of get away from the term Latin America and think about three different types of states in the region. And this is a region that contains a number of upper middle income states that are quite capable, that have relatively decent GDP per capita, that are capable of achieving positive economic outcomes that can contribute to foreign policy in the region. Here I'm thinking of countries like Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, countries that have sort of, in a sense, enough wealth that they interact with the rest of the world much the way many other middle powers do. They're still developing, obviously, but they have to keep in mind a country like Mexico is something like the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, which is on par with countries like South Korea, which is a major East Asian powerhouse. So there's a group of countries that are middle income countries, and maybe we don't really hear that much about them in the United States because they usually don't have many problems to draw the attention of the news. Then there's another group of states that really are very troubled. And those we do hear about. These are states in Central America that are beset by crime. Many of them are in the Caribbean. They're vulnerable to issues related to climate. There's countries like Venezuela, where something like 25% of the population has migrated as economic refugees just in the past 10 to 15 years. These are really very troubled states, and those are the ones that we tend to hear about, I think, the most day to day, I think, in the United States, typically because it's associated with issues related to migration or drugs or organized crime. And then there's a group of states that maybe are not exactly developing as rapidly as they could. Their politics are not as democratic as they could be. But really, these are choices they have made, and they could quickly be reversed. A very typical country in this category is Argentina, which goes through cycles of doing quite well and then politically reverting to doing quite poorly. And now it's on one of its down cycles, but I expect that it'll come back. So this gives you a sense of kind of a region that's made up of a group of capable countries, a group of maybe countries that are in real trouble, that are failing in significant ways, and countries which are in trouble, but the trouble can be reversed. So that's how I tend to think of the region. Although I know the region was categorized in the Great Decisions article, I think politically speaking, between sort of social democracies, populist countries, and dictatorships. So in this talk, I'm going to cover, basically touch on, I think, really 4 or 5 different things. I will talk a little bit about the politics of the region, just differently, I think, though, than how the Great Decisions piece approached it. I will talk about the economics of the region because I think it's very important for understanding how their foreign policy operates. Then I'll touch on foreign policy issues and security issues, and I'll conclude talking a little bit about policy issues, both in the United States and in other parts of the world, other countries that interact significantly with Latin America, particularly China. So I think one of the key things that I always try to keep in mind when I think about politics in Latin America is there's a left-right divide in the politics of the region, but it's very different from the left-right divide in our country. In many ways, this is because of a different intellectual tradition they inherited when it came to politics at the time of independence, influenced much more by the French Revolution, whereas the US Revolution was much more influenced by sort of British ideas, by the Glorious Revolution in the United Kingdom. And this gave a different framework for politics that orients around what traditionally had been a liberal conservative dimension, where liberal does not mean liberal as in the United States, where it often is associated with progressive politics. Liberal in Latin America, as actually is true pretty much everywhere else in the world, means libertarian. It means free market. It means small government. It means free trade. And so many of the early Latin American revolutions in the 19th century that freed them from Spain were led by local landowners and sort of local aristocrats, but people who were sort of inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. So that this very ambivalent relationship between actually being quite wealthy and also having the ideas they inherited from the Enlightenment and from France. And so traditionally, the division in Latin America was between these liberals who were for free markets, free trade, free labor, and conservatives who were sort of pro-Catholic Church, pro-slavery, and and anti-free trade. And so that's a very different, I think, political base from which to proceed, maybe one that resembles much more the United States before the Civil War, I'd say. And how that has evolved is that, in fact, over time, sort of these conservative ideas were largely defeated. And what was left is the politics of the small L liberal, i.e. libertarian, sort of free versus new ideas that came in associated with socialism, social democracy, which were picked up by the left in Latin America. So the right in Latin America tends to be fairly oriented towards free markets, but it's considerably more, quote unquote, progressive than most conservative politics would be in the United States, whereas the social democracies would be quite a bit more progressive than even progressives are in the United States. So the whole spectrum shifts somewhat to the left from our perspective. The only country where I'd say that's a little bit different is Brazil. And that's recently. And I think Brazil is very interesting because in many ways its history resembles that of the United States. I'd be happy to touch on that in Q&A. But it's interesting in that its politics is much more resembling contemporary polarized US politics. And I think that's in part because of how the evolution of sort of populist sort of right-wing ideas in Brazil, especially embodied by recently President Bolsonaro, came to be. But again, maybe we can touch on Brazil in the question Q&A. I'm hoping to go through the talk relatively quickly, so we have a lot of time for discussion. The other thing to keep in mind about the region is that it's mostly democratic, although, of course, there's been some reversion since the end of the Cold War in countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador. Cuba has been authoritarian for quite a long time now. But in the rest of the region, we have to understand that these discussions that you might have seen of sort of the pink tide or the return of the pink tide to refer to left-wing politics is really a reflection of cyclical politics. Just like in the United States or Europe or other places that have democracy, there's still a kind of throw the bums out every so often, right? And so Latin American voters get tired of politicians under-delivering on promises, and they tend to shift to the other party. Sometimes the parties have a longer run than usual. The left in Latin America between 2000 and 2012 benefited greatly from a prolonged economic boom. But once that economic boom ended, the tide reversed and conservative governments came into power. And then COVID hit in 2020, and many of the governments in the region performed quite poorly in response to COVID. And so the voters threw them out. And so now you have the left coming back in. So this is just the regular cyclical democratic politics of the region. But I think in many ways, one of the more important things to consider about related to the politics of the region, I think maybe helps explain some of the politics of the region, is the economy of Latin America. And again, you can't speak of one single economy for the region. It really is broadly, I'd say 2 or maybe 2.5. There is a sphere around North America, North and Central America, and the Caribbean that's really very tied into the United States. It is industrialized. Mexico is now a heavily industrialized country. Mexico, in fact, competes with China to produce industrial products for the United States. Of course, this dates back to NAFTA and currently the new revised US-Mexico-Canada trade arrangement. But this will be relevant later when we talk about the role of China in the region, because you see in Washington, when they do pay attention to Latin America, one of the things they worry about is the role of China in Latin America. So you have this North American sphere where it's really from relatively sophisticated industrial operations in Mexico to things that are closer to what was once called in the Mexican case maquila, just assembly of industrial products, taking advantage of cheap labor in places like the Dominican Republic or El Salvador or Honduras. You'll see this in clothing a lot, for example. A lot of U.S. clothing manufacturers have been affected by this as the U.S. has offshored. Some of that is done in Southeast Asia now, but a lot of it's done in Central America and the Caribbean. So that tends to tie the countries of Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean more closely to the United States. There's also, of course, a significant service industry in the Caribbean with tourism that's also tied to North America. But South America is really quite different. And South America relies much more on the production of primary products. So energy, oil and natural gas, mining, agro-industry, huge exporter of food to the rest of the world. One of the main consumers of those products internationally has been China in the last 20 years. As China really entered the international trading arena starting really in about 2000, I'd say. But my colleague Tom would probably know the dates a little bit better, but around that time, South America became a major source of those products for China. And that tended to tie those countries more closely to China because there was the trade flows were over time backed up by investment flows and by lending flows, capital flows. So I'll touch on that in the foreign policy. But from the Latin American perspective, from the South American perspective, that has a couple of effects. It is very good for the groups that control those industries, the large farming operations in Brazil or in Argentina, for example, or mining conglomerates in Peru. But it tends to be less good for the general population because these tend to be industries that are highly concentrated and use few workers. So agriculture in Brazil and Argentina is just as mechanized and industrialized as U.S. agriculture. In fact, for a while there was U.S. farmers sort of leaving the Midwest and moving to Brazil because of sort of lower cost of production and greater yields. So it doesn't use that much labor, which means that it doesn't spread much wealth in terms of wages or income. So you tend to have these concentrations, sort of peaks of economic power, and great deal of economic inequality. And so one of the things that South America has traditionally struggled to do is industrialize, because industrial jobs tend to have better wages and better benefits and working conditions. And so that has been somewhat affected by the role of China, which tends to reverse that. In part because China's policies are to try to capture as much of the value-added chain in production. So you'd import soy or wheat, but you wouldn't mill or process it in Argentina or Brazil. You would try to add as little value in those countries as possible and add as much value as possible in China, where, of course, you can capture that wealth. So this is sometimes referred to as the reprimarization of South America's economies, whereas primarization refers to the primary products like oil, gas, mining, agriculture. So that's the legal economy of Latin. Let me turn now to the illicit economy of Latin America. And the region does have a very significant non-legal economy. It really comes in two flavors. One of them is pretty normally, routinely found in many developing countries. It's sort of the part of the economy that's informal, that's not captured by formal taxation systems. It's not formally registered with the government. These are people sort of working on their own, or street vendors, or, they're not paying taxes, they're working informally. This often means they don't get benefits. It also means they can't get access to things like loans or mortgages. So depending on the degree of informality in your economy, that can actually hold people back from accessing the kinds of maybe credit or benefits or education, for example, that they might if they were part of the formal economy. Some countries have relatively high degrees of informality. Other countries like Brazil have very low amounts of informality. Brazil's economy is largely within the formal sector. And this has consequently an impact on taxation and funding available for governments, and therefore the ability of governments to deliver services to people. So this has a knock-on effect on politics, of course. So that's one kind of non-formal economy. The other kind of informal economy is, of course, the one associated with illegal goods, illegal trafficking in persons, drugs, organized crime. And this is significant in the region, particularly in Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, but from Bolivia up through Colombia, and increasingly Brazil and Argentina. And this is in part because the United States is the largest market for illicit drugs in the world. And so just from terms of economics, if you just take away the fact something is legal or illegal, just supply and demand, if the demand is in one part and the supply is available in countries such as Bolivia or Colombia, in the case of coca and cocaine production, or in Mexico in the case of synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl. It's just the logical consequences of economic supply and demand. Of course, these are illegal, so they become part of an illicit market, which is characterized by a great deal of organized crime, violence, non-transparency. These are revenues and funds and capital that's not available for taxation, that cannot be then used by governments to deliver services. So there's a number of knock-on effects that are related to this. But simply put, because of the United States being the largest market and the European Union being the second largest market, very likely, the flows of drugs out from South America and Central America, through Central America and Mexico, have a consequence of creating a base for organized crime in these countries. And not just in countries like that are transit countries like Mexico or production countries like Bolivia or Colombia. It's the transit countries along the way, like Central America or Brazil and Argentina to the EU, in part because organized crime gangs tend to pay people in their own product. So they pay people with illicit drugs. And of course, local gangs then turn around and resell it in local markets. And for that reason, countries like Argentina and Brazil probably have levels of, yes, problems with drugs like cocaine that are about as bad as the United States on a per capita basis. So this is really a very serious problem and challenge to rule of law and to countries across the region. So I'm going to turn now to talking a little bit, since I was just talking about illicit drugs, to issues related to security, and then I'll come back to foreign policy. So I mentioned the issue of organized crime, and it's really paradoxical because Latin America is probably one of the most peaceful places in the world when it comes to relations between states. You haven't had a war since 1995. I think the last terrorist attack was in Argentina. International terrorist attack was in Argentina in 1994. Can't think of too many other parts of the world that have that kind of record. This is a region of the world that has a tradition of settling interstate disputes by diplomacy and by arbitration. Disputes between countries about their borders, for example, much more likely to be referred to the International Court at The Hague. And this has become only more so since the region democratized in the 1970s and 80s, in part because the democratic leaders of those countries at that time, these early new democracies, recognized that having militarized disputes with their neighbors, having the prospect of war with your neighbor meant empowering your own military. And for most of these countries and for most of these democratic governments, their own militaries were a bigger threat to them than their neighbors' militaries. So if you get rid of the disputes and the threats, you can justify having smaller militaries that are less able to intervene against you. So it was all very instrumental in many ways, but it really has come to be a region that is, internationally speaking, at peace and with strong preference for diplomatic resolution of disputes. But it's also one of the most violent regions in the world internally. Within states, it's incredibly violent. Many of the cities with the highest per capita murder rates in the world are found in Latin America. And the last time I looked, admittedly, this was before COVID, it was the only region of the world where the per capita murder rates were rising instead of falling, outside of war zones. Obviously, war zones are their own thing. But for countries that were not at war, this was the only region of the world where murder rates per capita were still rising. So this creates a problem that we'll talk about when we get to the policy section, in that Latin American states, on the one hand, have this fantastic track record when it comes to peace internationally and diplomatically, but they have domestic political and security situations that really undermine their efforts to become more involved, I think, internationally. So there's kind of a sense of you have to have your own house in order before you can really contribute abroad. And that has periodically undermined, I think, the ability of many Latin American countries to play a significant role internationally. And in fact, when it comes to foreign policy, we can see this in that I think many tend to view the region as being sort of subject to external forces. I mean, it's not true. Latin America has its own views on the world and its own approach to its foreign policy. But you definitely have, with the return of great power competition, this US-Russia, US-China rivalry, a sense that Latin America is once again becoming another region of the world where this competition plays out. By and large, peacefully so far, thankfully, compared to Africa or the Middle East, for example. But nevertheless, more and more in Washington, D.C. and other parts of the world, there is this sense that Latin America is part of this competition. Partially it's related to the economics I explained earlier, the fact that China is such an important consumer of Latin America's or South America's products, whereas Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean are very much more connected to the United States through exports of industrial products and through migration. It's South America and Latin America are important because outside of Africa, they're a region with a relatively large number of votes in multilateral institutions like the United Nations. So for a country like China that wants to become more important internationally, to become a major power, if not a superpower, gathering up those votes in multilateral institutions is important. It's part of the reason I think why China is also quite interested in Africa, is that ability to secure diplomatic support in multilateral venues. And you see this in China's approach to the region, where it very much emphasizes South-South relations. It emphasizes China's history as a country that was, in a sense, bullied by European powers and by the United States, and that has a common solidarity with other countries of the global South, even though China is, of course, quite powerful now. And it approaches South America on the basis of building up common diplomatic ties and approaches around these ideas, these shared ideas about South-South solidarity. One thing that China does not do very well is distinguish among the various regions of Latin America. They do tend to lump all of Latin America together and prefer to have these regional diplomatic fora to manage Latin American relations. And in fact, even their bilateral ties have not been particularly fruitful necessarily, or they certainly had their missteps. The other thing that China has to offer Latin America, which is, I think, very important, is in terms of foreign policy, is China's ability to provide major investment projects. You've probably heard of Belt and Road Initiative in the context of other parts of the world, major Chinese investments in infrastructure in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. Latin America is not really part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but many of the same conditions apply. China is able to deliver major infrastructure projects and provide favorable financing as a package. And in cases where the required workforce is not available, it'll even provide the workforce. So that is quite attractive for many Latin American countries because the alternatives are either international capital markets, so you're going to Wall Street basically, to take out loans and the rates are maybe not as favorable, or you're going to the places like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, where they're much more bureaucratic than China is. The paperwork required to fund projects is much more onerous in those cases, whereas China is much more willing to be flexible. And for many countries, that is important, especially for countries that are heavily indebted already or have poor credit otherwise. China is a very attractive option. Whereas for the United States, when it approaches the region, there's a sense that of all the different crises that the United States faces on any given day, Latin America is not close to the top of the list. When I was at the Brookings Institution, it was just 8-10 years ago at Washington, D.C., and I directed the Latin America Initiative in the foreign policy program there. One of the things I was struck by just from talking to people around Washington, D.C. was that Washington seemed to be able to handle about 3 foreign policy crises at any given instance. And Latin America was always down around 7, 8, or 9. And so it really got very little attention. At the time, there was actually some, I think, optimistic and hopeful ideas at the time. There's a sense that, yes, China is rising. Yes, China is competing with us in terms of infrastructure and investment. We know Latin America needs this badly. What can we do to make it, to compete in that dimension? But also a strong sense that the U.S. could compete at least as a trade partner. China is not really a very good trade partner for South America, for Latin America, if you produce anything other than primary products. Because China, there's a lot of non-tariff barriers to the importation of industrial products into China. So that means that countries like Mexico, for example, that produce their own industrial products can't really compete in China. So they would much rather trade with the United States. And that's true for many other manufacturers across the region. So even in countries like Brazil or Argentina or Peru that have large primary product exporters, they also have industrial sectors that would love to be able to export more, and the United States is a much more attractive market. Unfortunately, I think it's not just during the Trump administration, but it's also true of the Biden administration, that there's generally been a turn against, I think, trade agreements and sort of free trade. The U.S. has generally been leery of that. And that is actually means that one of the things that might be quite attractive for South America or for Latin America about working for the United States has been taken off the table. So when it comes to thinking about U.S. policy towards the region, the U.S. is sort of admonishing the region that be careful of China, beware of China, but it hasn't really been able to offer much as an alternative. The U.S. doesn't really have the big infrastructure construction firms that are state-owned. It doesn't have big state-owned banks. The decision was made by the United States and its allies after World War II to basically outsource all that to the World Bank, to regional development banks, and to the private sector. So you get your development loan, from the World Bank. You maybe run put a project up for bid. Maybe Bechtel or General Electric win the bid, and they build it for you. There's not this package deal where China will say, okay, we can give you the financing, we can give you the firm, we can give you the workers, and this will be done guaranteed in a couple of years. And so the U.S. doesn't have that. I don't expect it ever will. I don't think that's an area where the U.S. can compete. I think trade is, but I don't think the mood is quite right now, I think, in the United States to open up on trade. So what are the two other policy issues? Of course, migration and drugs. And in neither of those cases does the U.S. really have an attractive offering for the region. These are obviously very serious problems. They're very serious security problems at the border because of drugs and migration. Interrelated, because one of the reasons there's so much migration from Central American countries is the failing states under the weight of organized crime and drug-related violence in those countries. But the U.S. response has been, for a long time now on drugs, and more recently now on migration, is you basically try to outsource the costs to Latin America. So let Mexico control migration at its southern border. Let Colombia control coca production, rather than try to control these issues within the United States, or try to change some of the underlying factors in the region that might be contributing to this. For example, by reducing demand for these products in the United States. But I'm happy to talk about these in greater detail. These are very nuanced issues, but sort of in broad terms, neither U.S. drug policy nor U.S. migration policy are that attractive for most Latin American countries, which has meant that as we look at the region, there's a sense that there are issues, there's things that are wrong, there's things we would like to see work differently. There's opportunities for partnership with Latin America, but there's, I think, probably less on the table to sustain that kind of U.S. partnership with the region than there has been in many years. So we'll just have to wait and see how both U.S. politics and Latin America's politics evolve to see if a brighter moment comes back around. So that's been about 35 minutes, Tom. I think maybe we could start taking some questions. Thank you all.
I moved up because I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask a couple of questions, drawing on Harold's presentation. That linking together or attempting to link together the divisions of Peter's Hall, the cultural traditions, political consequences of that economy and foreign policy. I guess the question is, what's wrong with this quickie analysis? That throughout the region, the power of the elite, the small elite relative to the size of the population, that originated in land, that produced a political system hostile to industrialization, or at least didn't put in place the legal framework to foster industrialization, because that was seen as competing with the sources of political power. That doesn't that reinforce the primary products economy, and doesn't, in the case of China, buy the primary products, attempt to flood the region with cheap industrial products, which undercuts the ability to develop indigenous industries, but the political elite is okay with that. Or have I overstated it far too much?
No, I think there's certainly a basis for that historically. I think it is certainly true that if you the logical consequence of reprimarization is to reinforce those traditional elites that draw their wealth from control of the land. And there are countries where that is not completely the case. I think in part because, like the United States, there's such large markets that there's enough demand domestically to generate consumer demand for industrial products anyway. I think Brazil is probably the main country that falls in that category. A little bit Mexico, although the competition for the United States is quite strong, obviously, or from China there. But in many other countries, it does tend to reinforce the traditional economic patterns that tend to concentrate wealth and they contribute to that inequality that is persistent in Latin American history. And this obviously has roots going back all the way to the pre-independence days, where many areas of Latin America were primarily set up for primary product extraction. Originally silver, obviously, and gold, but later on other products. So yes, I think that's the issue, is that China's role reinforces the traditional politics of Latin America, not sort of the newer politics associated with industry and industrial workers and urban politics. So one of the tensions, of course, in the region is that even though that's true, the region is increasingly urbanized, which means that, people have gone to the cities looking for opportunities, and there's definitely some better opportunities in cities, but you've tend to have fallen in many countries into what some call sort of the middle income trap, where countries are sort of middle income countries now, but populations in cities increasingly have expectations for sort of closer to upper income kind of services and benefits, especially in the middle class. And I think that tends to drive some of the political instability that we see. And of course, if you have an economic structure in South America, in a number of countries, which tends to reinforce kind of elite control of the primary product sector, where it's very difficult to redistribute income away from those to try to satisfy some of these middle class, working class demands, you get a lot of political turmoil. I think you can see a little bit of this maybe in Peru, for example, which I think has gone through, I sort of lost track of how many presidents they've had in the last term, but they seem to impeach them within a year or so at a time.
Yeah, I think it's 3 within the last regular term of office. Another question before opening it up to others. That for as long as I can remember, the expression Brazil has a fantastic future, and it always will, meaning it can't get there. can't realize its potential. Similar things said about Argentina. The overlay or the interplay of democracy, and reasonably fair and free functioning democracy, perpetuating stagnation. And that to me is a puzzlement. You got a whole lot of ordinary people that don't outvote the elite. How does that happen?
So I think the issue, I think that's probably true up till about the 40s and 50s of the last century. And then you start seeing dynamics where you see a little bit more of a struggle to try to address this. Sometimes it results in military governments, military coups. We saw in Argentina and Brazil in the 70s, for example, 60s and 70s in both countries, as sort of, urban populations and urban elites tried to get a bigger share of the political pie and the economic pie, so to speak. Under democracy, you've seen leaders such as Lula da Silva in Brazil, or Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner in Argentina, or Petro in Colombia now, who are sort of representing sort of more of the politics of trying to rebalance between sort of traditional politics, traditional elites, and the rest of the population, and trying to do so within democracy. I think of all of them, Lula was the most successful during his original 2 terms in office, 2002, 2010, where he greatly expanded the middle class, and generally, reduced critical poverty down to practically zero. But the reason he was able to do it was a huge commodity boom in Brazil. And Brazil has a relatively strong state for the region. I mentioned that it doesn't have much of an informal economy, for example. Most economic activity is formally registered with the state. So they had the basis for trying to break out of this trap that they've been in. But part of the problem, of course, is commodity booms eventually end. That means your national income drops. That means there's less wealth to fund demands from sort of urban populations. And in the case of Brazil, it really was associated with the bursting of a credit bubble. So one of the things Lula had done was make easy credit available, which tended to lift people out of poverty because it created a new middle class that could use these credit instruments. But of course, eventually, inflation went up, interest rates went up, and this new middle class found itself in real trouble when it due to its debt. So you see this cycle over and over again where countries aren't quite able to break out of this problem. I think in Argentina, it's been much harder than Brazil. But of all the countries, I think Brazil has probably made the most progress towards breaking out of it. Keep in mind at one point in time, 10 or 15 years ago, Brazil had like the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. So that's like up around Russia or the UK. Yeah. So that's now it's back down to like 9th or 10th. So another indication of how quickly its fortunes can come and go.
Are there questions here in the room?
Are there unions involved?
Are there unions involved is the question.
Yes, and in fact, that's one of the hallmarks of the urban politics I was referring to, is unions by and large are a reflection of urban industrial workplaces, very significant in places like Brazil, Argentina. In fact, I think most countries in South America have pretty strong union bases, but a lot of that's also related to how much of the economy is formal, because for a union to exist, there has to be sort of a formal workplace that's under government regulation, where you can enforce rules that allow unions to be set up, that there's a formal tax system and a paycheck where the union dues can be taken out. It's very practical, right? That you need sort of this formal economy that therefore creates the conditions to have a formal labor union. Because the alternative is sort of these sort of very informal, more protest-oriented movements. You may have heard of Brazil, for example, of the translation of the movement of those without land, right? So these are, peasants don't own their own land. They'll occupy large tracts of land owned by elites to try to put pressure on the government, on the elites to engage in land redistribution. So that's like an informal way. But the actual union politics tend to look very much like union politics in, let's say, Europe. Not so much the United States, because unions have declined a lot in the United States compared to, I think, many places in Latin America. But again, it just depends. If you have a small formal economy, that's a smaller basis for union politics. Whereas in a country like Brazil, which has a larger formal economy, there's a bigger role for union politics. So
I have a question. Okay, and I actually wrote it, so I'll just read it. Shouldn't the U.S. take on a more active role in development in Latin America to protect our own interests and counteract China's involvement? For example, China's hydroelectric dam construction against science recommendation because of earthquakes in Ecuador that failed as soon as it was activated, but left Ecuador with the bill.
yes. No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How is that in our interest?
It's not, but it was in the interest of some Chinese and Ecuadorian politicians,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
So it's, I'd have to say that, I'm sorry, that was a little bit of a glib answer, but it's true in the sense of it. This is one of the reasons why politicians and political leaders in Latin America find China attractive to work with, because deals can be made nearly on a handshake basis without a lot of formal paperwork. The issue the United States has is we don't have, nor have we, is there any appetite to set up large development banks like China has? China has large banks that can commit the billions of dollars needed to finance infrastructure in Latin America or in Africa or anywhere else in the world. They also have large state-owned construction companies, which again do not exist in the United States, nor do we really expect that they ever will exist in the United States. So the Chinese government can actually put together that package in a way that the United States cannot. So the United States has tried to think about ways in which it could be more competitive in this area, but in fact, it did make one small loan to Ecuador, which had so many conditions attached to it that it ended up not working very well. But that's kind of why I mentioned in my comments that probably the place where the U.S. is better positioned to compete is trade, free trade, because the U.S. market is much more open. And that ability to trade and to produce for the U.S. market creates its own development opportunities in Latin America. So it's a different kind of approach to thinking about development, but it's simply that the United States is not structured to provide the same kind of deals that China can, nor do I think it is likely that the U.S. Congress would ever approve the creation of either large state development banks aimed at development or large state-owned construction companies that would build the infrastructure in the same way that China does. So this might be one of those cases where trying to compete on the same playing field as China doesn't really make that much sense. But your point is very fair. That's exactly why Ecuador is going to China to build these projects, and why it finds China attractive, because China doesn't ask questions about, for example, is this a good place to build a dam? They just know that there's a deal to build a dam, and so the rest of it doesn't matter as much. Whereas if Ecuador had gone to the World Bank, for example, to get a loan, you can be sure the World Bank would have asked, is this a good place to build a dam?
If I can
We have several more questions online. The first one, and Karina, you've asked one question. We'll come back to your second one later. Should the U.S. be more active in Central America to help reduce the societal problems that cause so many to flee to the United States?
Undoubtedly, I think that would be an excellent idea. I think the United States has put some funding towards these initiatives, but the scale of the problem is such that I'm not sure the United States quite is sure how to gain traction on the problem. It's not just a matter of development. This is a matter of rule of law and the deep penetration of organized crime into the political structures in a number of these countries, such as Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador to a certain extent, where it's the very government that you're dealing with to try to address the problems that is compromised by organized crime up to the very highest levels. And so at a certain point in time, if you're giving development funds to governments that are significantly compromised and under the influence of these organized crime enterprises who do not have an interest in changing the conditions in the region, what do? Right? These are sovereign countries. You have to work through governments to try to get things done, but those governments are run by people who are not necessarily interested in things changing or being different. So it's a very difficult problem. The United States has tried to take an approach of supporting, working together with the United Nations, for example, or the Organization of American States, of helping create rule of justice initiatives. By the Spanish name in Guatemala was called CICIG, which was like a special court designed to go after corruption in Guatemala, quite successful initially. In fact, so successful that the Guatemalan elites eventually kicked it out. There was an attempt to do the same in El Salvador with less positive results, but again, no longer effective. So in principle, of course, you're right. The United States should do more, but you are basically operating in an environment where it's you're interacting with a system that is literally conspiring to undermine your best efforts in some cases.
So here's a question that I think you answered with your last answer. Is there sufficient, quote unquote, rule of law in South American countries so that American capital is willing to invest?
I think that varies a lot. I think when you look at Central America, for example, probably not the case. Depends on the country, though. Certainly, Costa Rica, Panama are generally seen as generally places where you can do business. I think in a number of countries like Colombia, Peru, Chile, generally people have pretty positive experiences. There's other countries like Venezuela, which is among one of the most corrupt countries in the world, according to Transparency International, where you probably wouldn't want to do business. So it really varies significantly country to country. And I think American business has to take a more nuanced approach to this. I think this is another area where you see the contrast between the US, Europe, and Japan in their approaches to investment in the region, and China. If you look at where US, European, and Japanese companies invest, they tend to invest in countries that are in the upper 50th percentile of rule of law indices. So the World Bank, for example, tabulates a rule of law index year to year that rates countries around the world. And sort of Western governments tend to, not governments, but corporations, investors tend to invest in countries with better rule of law. China has by and large been indifferent to rule of law issues in terms of its investments, which has actually hurt it in some cases like Venezuela. But that means that in countries where the rule of law is poor, for example, let's say Venezuela or Ecuador, you tend to have this phenomenon where Chinese capital investments are overrepresented in a certain case because other countries were avoiding them. So China, of course, becomes more influential in those countries. But of course, Western, US, Japanese, European countries, companies are doing the smart thing to invest in higher rule of law countries. But the effect is such that it maybe doesn't foster conditions for reforming rule of law in sort of countries that are less do less well on that scale.
Do you have more questions in the room, or should I continue online?
We've got one here, Lou. Diane?
You're the expert on Venezuela. What's going on? We, here in the United States, we hear a little bit about Venezuela and then it kind of drops out of the media. And then it kind of percolates up to the top again, but, can you give us a little?
Sure. So Venezuela is in an interesting situation now in the sense that it's a full-fledged authoritarian regime at this point. But it is in a cycle where it's coming up on elections, periodic presidential elections in 2024. And people see that as an opportunity to try to maybe move the needle back towards freer and fair elections. Right now, elections are not free, they're not fair, the playing field is not level. It's also a country whose economy has collapsed. It's the worst economic outcomes, even compared to countries that at war, like Syria, or after the collapse of the Soviet Union, countries in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet space. Venezuela has experienced a larger collapse of that. It's recovered slightly in the last couple of years, but it's still a country where maybe 300,000 people live extremely well, and another 25 million live in abject poverty. It's really, incredibly unequal. And that was not true historically. Venezuela at one point had quite a large middle class. In fact, I grew up in Venezuela back when that was the case. So the issue for the regime is that it has, in a sense, allowed a lot of people to migrate outwards, which has the benefit as a double benefit. It gets rid of people who have enough initiative to leave, which are also the people who have enough initiative to change politics and to go out and protest or to try to, organize or change conditions in Venezuela. And those people send money back to their relatives, which takes pressure off the regime, which it's a state-run economy. The government's in charge of many enterprises. So that's less people it has to feed. So the government economic production oil production was recovered slightly. Venezuela is a very large oil producer, though not as large as it used to be. One of the problems the regime is having, and oil prices are up, so it's not feeling the heat quite as much anymore. So there's currently the prospects of negotiations in Mexico between the opposition and the government. They're supposed to have started. They're still feeling around how that's going to work, but the government does not really have a whole lot of incentive for allow free and fair elections. It's quite unpopular. But the opposition is also very unpopular at this point. That wasn't always true, but it is now. Their popularity of the opposition is slightly higher than that of the government. They're both quite low. A lot of Venezuelans would just like a pox on both their houses. So we'll have to see what happens going forward. But part of the issue, of course, for Venezuela is that its oil production fell from maybe 3 million barrels per day in 2000, when Hugo Chavez, the former president, first took power, to about 600,000 barrels per day now. And that's a huge drop off in what is one of the mainstays of the Venezuelan economy. So that helps to explain why the economy is doing so poorly in Venezuela. But that's the outline of it at this point.
Any other questions here in the room? Great.
We have heard in the past that the conditions that in Africa that China puts on for loans, blah, 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 isn't particularly advantageous to that country. Is that happening in South America as well?
So
Repeat the question.
it's a question is, are Chinese development loans made on advantageous conditions to countries in Central and South America? They're not particularly advantageous or disadvantageous. I think they're pretty close to market rates, although they don't quite look like Western loans. There's different arrangements that can be made. For example, in the case of Venezuela, what they've been doing is giving loans which are paid back with Venezuelan oil. That's sort of on a kind of a swap basis in a certain sense. The issue really is not so much that the loans are not advantageous, is that they're being taken out by countries that Western creditors would not lend more money to because they think they're not able to to successfully repay the loans. So this is more of a question of the Chinese are willing to take more risks, or they think they can manage these situations politically, as in the case of Ecuador, or they're backing up their loans with products such as oil that they expect to be able to recoup at some point. So Ecuador, as somebody asked about this dam that was built with Chinese infrastructure funding, a lot of Ecuador's future oil exports are earmarked to pay for Chinese loans. But the issue is not that the loans were necessarily at some disadvantageous, like in terms of higher interest rates or something like that. No, it's just they were made to a country that really wasn't capable of taking out more loans in the first place, right? And so that's what's disadvantageous, is that I think international creditors would have looked at the country and said, no, you can't repay this loan, so we're not going to make it to you. Whereas China was like, oh, yeah, we'll make it to you anyway. We'll figure out how to, you'll pay us back later. Don't worry about it. Literally.
But that's a problem that it is just over the horizon in South America. Loans from the Chinese for projects that probably shouldn't have been built because they can't repay. And as it already happened in Africa, countries either can't repay or choose not to repay. So we'd like to repay the loan that you gave us to build this port, but I need that money for healthcare, for education, to stay in power on it. And the Chinese increasingly are in the position of, do they squander what little influence they have by trying to get repaid?
Right.
Or do they accept being stiffed? They're going to be stiffed in Venezuela.
Well, there already happens.
$80 billion, and the Venezuelan government said, sorry, we can't pay. It said, but the oil was committed. And they said, sorry, we got to use that oil to earn hard currency. And that hard currency is not to repay you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, the Venezuelan case is very important because for China in the region, because half of China's loans to Latin America were made to Venezuela. And so the Chinese made the loans on the assumption that the Venezuelans would invest in their oil industry and increase production, and therefore there'd be more oil available to pay them back, which seems kind of sensible. But it's not what the Venezuelans did. They spent the money for consumption and to win elections and to, line people's pockets and so on and so forth. And so when it came time to repay China, not only were they producing less oil, but the oil was less valuable. So essentially the Chinese had to declare sort of a repayment holiday, in a sense. Like they deferred repayments on the loans into the future. And what was particularly infuriating to them was that the Venezuelans repaid loans the Russians had made to them. And the reason was that the Russians had loaned them money to buy weapons, and the Venezuelans government, wanting to retain the support of its own military, agreed to prioritize payments to Russia in return for the Russians providing technicians to help restore operability, thank you, to the Russian weapon systems that have been sold to Venezuela. So this was a double whammy to the Chinese. That, not only we're not getting repaid, but the Russians are getting paid ahead of us. And in fact, the Russians were actually really quite predatory in the Venezuelan case. One of the things they did was not only were they getting paid back first, but at one point in time, the Venezuelan government under Hugo Chavez had expropriated foreign Western companies' investments in Venezuela. So there had been an oil opening for some particularly difficult to exploit and extract oil in sort of central Venezuela. It's sort of a heavy, sour crude, which has a very specific meaning in oil production, but it's more expensive, requires more technology to successfully extract. They'd brought in Italian, French, American, British, Dutch companies, along with sort of Chinese, Russian, Vietnamese, and other countries. But the the Western companies were expropriated. And so then what Venezuela did was to help back up these loans to the Russians. They basically would give them these shares that have been expropriated from Western companies to Russian companies. So the Russians have taken a bigger and bigger stake. Now you may think, why are the Russians accepting investments and, being paid back in shares in companies in this country that's, impoverished in the middle of economic political turmoil? Well, the basic explanation is that in Venezuela, you extract this oil and ship it 100 kilometers down a pipeline to the coast and lift it to international markets, or you extract it and ship it 5,000 kilometers down a heated pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe. So what's better, the 100 kilometers to the tanker or the 5,000 to Western Europe? The Russians are like, I think I'll take the shorter pipeline. Thank you very much. So that has led them to take a long-term view on Venezuela and be willing to absorb these shares of these formerly Western-held companies as repayment. So that might have been a little bit too much detail, but that's
No, it's
kind of
not.
what's going on.
And it links to last week's discussion of economic warfare. Because one of the reasons that Venezuela did not invest money that they got from the Chinese and the Russians and others into increasing oil production was the US blocked that technology. That they had the money, but the Americans built this oil industry. So what they needed came from the United States, and I believe Biden has either announced or relaxed the restrictions on energy. You probably know, on
there was
extraction technology.
By and large, Chevron is in the one U.S. company that stayed in, and they require a license to continue to operate because of the sort of sanctions on Venezuela. But it is true that one of the issues the Venezuelans have had was, their own state-owned oil company 20, 30 years ago also pioneered some of these techniques for extracting sour heavy crude. Heavy crude just means it's very dense and hard to, it doesn't flow easily. So you actually either have to heat it up or you have to inject gas or steam down into the well to get it to flow to the surface. And sour just means that it contains a lot of sulfur. So you have to refine it in particular ways to make it saleable in sort of Western countries to meet kind of environmental standards. So the Venezuelans had invested quite a bit of technology, but a lot of the technology is really drawn from either their own sources, which they no longer have that know-how, or from Western sources. And so the problem they've been having is that sort of Russian, Chinese, Vietnamese, et cetera, companies don't really have the technology to exploit the kind of oil that Venezuela has. So even though people say Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, a lot of that oil is this ultra heavy sour crude that is more expensive to exploit and requires more advanced technology to successfully do so.
Lou, you got another question?
We have several. Let's change the thrust here a little bit. Linda asks about the connection between drugs and organized crime. And her comment is, isn't the US part of the problem? Because we insist on criminalizing the drugs here, and that just gives more impetus for it to come in under the radar and support organized crime in Latin America. So
that's an interesting question. I think there's a couple dimensions to it. One is the question of legal and illegal. So it's true that by making a product illegal, what you've done in a sense is remove the ability for participants in that part of the economy, to use formal structures for adjudicating disputes, like courts or arbitration or lawyers, or any of the number of ways that a legal commercial enterprise would settle a dispute with other companies or compete peacefully for market share, right? Once it's illegal, you basically remove those, and now you have the way you settle things is via force, right? Not only that, The people who are willing to accept the risk of operating in an illicit market are probably willing to accept the risk of, using guns and, shooting at their adversaries and sort of taking over territory and clearing out of the gangs. And so the result is a fair amount of violence associated with illicit products. Now, this is compounded in the United States in a sense that the transporting goods to the U.S. border and getting them across travels through a certain number of fairly restricted routes. I mean, people worry about, a lot of the arguments about building a wall on the border with Mexico was, look at all this open space. That's where the drugs must be coming through. No, the drugs come through in the buses and cars through the regular ports of entry, because the U.S. government can only inspect about 1% of the vehicles crossing the border. So if you're a drug trafficker, 1% loss rate. There's probably more shrinkage on the floor of Walmart from people, shoplifting than there is like the risk of losing. Being flip again. But you get the point, right? If you're a drug trafficker and you're trying to get products in the United States, the issue is controlling access to the ports of entry. And that's where there's been quite a bit of conflict. Now, the reason why there's so much more violence now than in the 70s and let's say early 80s on the Mexican border is in part because of changes in political conditions in Mexico. So traditionally, before Mexico democratized, the ruling party, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, by its English name, essentially informally regulated all the organized crime cartels that were transiting drugs on the border and told people, stay in your lane. You're not allowed, there's no violence allowed. And we'll leave you alone. We won't interfere with your operations of transporting things to the United States as long as you stop shooting each other. And that actually worked to keep the border quite peaceful. But of course, it did nothing for stopping the transit of illicit drugs in the United States. And once Mexico democratized, subsequent governments, particularly from the conservative PAN government under President Vicente Fox, you may remember, and much more readily adopted the U.S. approach of war on drugs. And they started going after these cartel organizations. So one of the phenomena that happens when you go after cartels, especially the approach that was being taken in Mexico, was they didn't really feel like they had the capacity to clean up organized crime wholesale. They didn't have enough reliable police. They didn't have enough trusted security forces. So they took an approach, and actually it was an approach the U.S. was using in places like Afghanistan and Iraq in terms of counterinsurgency, of decapitation strikes, right? You take out the head of the cartel, right? If you just take out the leadership of the cartel, then the whole thing's going to fall apart, and that's going to solve the problem. Well, it's true that it does fall apart, but the problem is that everybody else that was sort of that wasn't able to operate in those areas because there was a big, strong cartel controlling the territory in the market, now rushes in. And in fact, violence goes up. And so Mexico went from having maybe 7 or 8 large cartels to now having over 100 cartelitos, small cartels. And of course, there's just a lot more violence associated with it. So there's several things going on. So of course, the fact that it's an illicit market does create some conditions for violence. But in the past, people were able to address that. I'm not saying this was a good thing. I'm just analytically observing that this is how it was handled. It was handled so there was large organizations. The government regulated them informally to make sure that there wasn't too much violence associated with the trade. Now, because of the change in the politics, the approach to counter-narcotics strategy in Mexico, the result has been a lot more violence because of the kind of strategy they pursued vis-a-vis the cartels. So,
thank you. Comment here, we never hear anything about Suriname or Guyana. Are they totally negligible because they are small and poor?
So it's interesting you should bring that up. Guyana, the politics of Guyana are going to be very interesting because they've just discovered a lot of offshore oil. And so, that could historically be a good thing. It could not go so well. I think one thing we observed from other oil producing countries is that if your rule of law institutions are strong before you discover oil, you tend to do pretty well. If your rule of law is pretty weak before you discover oil, then the oil, just basically tends to fuel corruption and political problems. So Guyana is not as bad as some countries in the region on rule of law issues, but it's not terribly strong as well. And I know that it's already caused some issues with the operation of this democracy, because one of the issues that happens when you have the prospect of a large amount of oil revenue is politics suddenly becomes this game of it becomes a redistribution game. It's like you're arguing over who gets what share of the pie. I just got a lot bigger, and so now there's a lot more incentive to fight over it in a certain sense. Some countries have solved that successfully. I mean, this was an issue obviously in Venezuela, but in Venezuela from 1958 to about 2000, it was solved peacefully. Basically, people worked out an arrangement, so like everybody got something. We'll see what happens in Guyana. Suriname is interesting because it's very small. It's got like maybe 500,000 people in it. It's a former Dutch colony. The only thing, and its politics have been a little bit turbulent. The one interesting thing is it is the one country in Latin America that really faces the impact of what you see in Africa, which is the presence of large numbers of recent Chinese immigrants because of a stranded workforce, where the Chinese were brought in to build major infrastructure projects. There's not that many people in Suriname, so they also brought workers. And now about 10% of the population of Suriname is these recently immigrated Chinese workers who were basically left there when the companies wrapped up their jobs. They never sent them home. So, but that's, you've reached the limit of my knowledge on Guyana and Suriname.
Lou, do you have any more questions?
Yes, we do. Karina had a follow-up comment and question talking about Argentina. Just before leaving office, Cristina Kirchner inked a nuclear deal with China, which gave China sovereign territory, leaving Argentina with no control over those facilities. Is this good for our hemisphere?
So I think you're referring to there was a nuclear deal, but there was also a space deal, like a space, like a satellite tracking type base that was set up in Argentina, where China was given sort of extraterritorial rights, like, to that. However, the successor government to Cristina Kirchner reversed a lot of that extraterritoriality. They were much less favorable to China. Now, under the new government, I don't know exactly what arrangement they've worked out with the Chinese. The Chinese base is still there. But I mean, this is the thing for China. I mean, it can work out these deals, but ultimately, the governments change, right? There's politics, there's elections, a different kind of government comes to power. And in the end, China is still very far away, right? It doesn't have the same kind of leverage that other countries, such as the United States, have had in the region historically. So in many ways, and this I think alludes to something Tom was saying about finances and loans, is that, there's historically quite a few Latin American countries that defaulted on their external debt. And, at least in South America, the result is maybe you can't access international capital markets for 5 or 10 years, but international bankers have short memories, and they like their profits, and eventually they think, oh, this is a good place to lend some money again. So, this is the thing. I think, sure, we can be concerned about the degree to which China is investing or lending money to these countries, but these countries are ultimately sovereign, and for them, China is quite far away. And if they decide to default on their Chinese loans, it's sort of like they defaulted on their US loans in the 60s or the British loans in the 30s, or, et cetera, back through time. So it's the consequences are sort of relatively limited from the perspective of Latin American governments. I think the thing to keep in mind about China and the region is a lot of people assign all the agency to China and very little agency to Latin America. But from the Latin American country, especially in South America, having China be an important presence is advantageous to you when you're dealing with Washington. right? Because you're triangulating, right? So the Chinese are giving me this deal. What are you giving me, right? And this is like a perennial sort of strategy used by, small and middle powers, right? Especially when there's competition. Now that we have great power competition, this is an available strategy again. So you can say, oh, well, the Chinese are, building a highway for us. What are you going to do for us? It's to the advantage of South American countries to play up the degree of Chinese influence as a way to try to see what they can get out of the United States to quote unquote counter China. Right.
Okay, two more questions. Next to the last, should the U.S. reverse Trump's policy on Cuba and do more to open up Cuba to trade and travel?
Okay, and then I think we have one in the room.
We have one in the room after this one.
Okay, so I generally think that had the trade and travel approach taken by the Obama administration was by and large positive. I think that over time, there's an argument to be made. In fact, my colleague at Brookings then, Richard Feinberg, has a couple of good pieces. You can go read them on the Brookings website. I think they're still very relevant. It's an argument about building up the Cuban middle class and changing the expectations in Cuba as to sort of politics and the economy. There's a reason why the Cuban government continuously reverses and allows some economic openness, then pulls it back because they know that those kinds of issues are a threat. But if there's enough travel, trade, investment, that could possibly have sort of a cycle of a virtuous cycle of its own. And it's not like the alternative has been so great up till now. So generally speaking, I think to the extent that you leave the decisions about sort of trade and investment in the hands of sort of the Cubans and their families, crossing back and forth between sort of where they are in the United States and in other parts of the region in Cuba, I think you could do a lot of good. So I don't see very much downside, especially because the alternative, which is the policies you had for whatever 30, 40 years before, don't seem to work terribly well. So I'll leave it at that. But I recommend just Google Richard Feinberg, Cuba, middle class. You'll find some good stuff.
Thank you.
Just quickly, getting back to the drugs, what do you think would be the impact on that whole system if we did decriminalize them?
So I think
The question, please.
the question is, what would be the impact on the whole system of sort of illicit drugs and organized crime if there were a process of decriminalization of drugs? So I think what we would see very likely, I suspect, is sort of the impact would be quite uneven. I think for drugs that can be produced in the United States, you're already seeing this with marijuana, you see a market that's sort of much less violent, right? I think there's some very hard drugs, though, that are going to be, I think the impacts on human health are severe enough that they're always going to be scheduled. They're always going to be restricted. And then there's these sort of drugs in the middle that you can say, well, if we decriminalize them, would violence go down? There's certainly an argument to be made for that effect. The question is, what are the trade-offs in terms of public health? I mean, certainly if we're going to go that route, I'd like to see a campaign that addresses those health issues that is at least as successful as the one against smoking. I mean, tobacco is a drug. It's not been criminalized ever, as far as I can tell. But there's been a very successful public health campaign that's really changed social mores as to smoking. I think if you could do that on some of these drugs, you could probably decrease the risks associated with decriminalization for public health. And in terms of violence, it depends. I suspect that the violence would tend to shift towards the harder drugs. So you've already seen that, for example, on fentanyl, increasing production of synthetic drugs in Mexico, using precursors imported from East Asia, as opposed to the traditional routes of bringing up, poppy, heroin, cocaine up from South America. So.
Once again, our allotted time has passed very quickly and very well, productively. Thank you, Harold, for a terrific presentation. Thanks to everyone for the questions that opened up more areas to the discussion. That a reminder that the video of this evening will be posted during the week on the Great Decisions portion of the First Church website. Feel free to tell people to look for it there. The topic next week is famine, and our speaker will be Bertrand Padamunda, who is an archivist at the Hoover Institution. And many of you may not remember that the origin of the Hoover Institution of War, Revolution, and Peace is a collection of materials brought back by Herbert Hoover when he was in charge of the famine relief program after World War I. So its roots go back. So being an archivist, he's working with early American interventions for famine relief, and his own work takes him right up to the famine of today. So I encourage you to join us next week, and thank you again, Harold, for a terrific presentation.
Thanks for the invitation.
Okay, everyone, sorry for the person whose question we didn't get to answer, but we are going to stop the recording now and stop the Zoom, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
Great. Thank you.